The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Salvation Creek, its rays turning the wooden buildings into furnaces. Sarah Mitchell sat chained to the hitching post outside the whitewashed church, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that had bound her there since dawn. The black mourning dress she had worn faithfully for 3 months since Thomas's death clung to her skin, soaked with perspiration and shame. "Water," she whispered through cracked lips, but the townsfolk passing by either averted their eyes or shot her looks of disgust. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, actually spat in the dirt near Sarah's feet before hurrying her children past. "Adulteress," the woman hissed under her breath, loud enough for Sarah to hear. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Thomas had been dead barely 90 days, killed in a cave-in at the silver mine, and she'd done nothing more than accept food from Miguel Santos when her money ran out. The Mexican trader had been kind, bringing her beans and cornmeal when she was too proud to beg. But in Salvation Creek, kindness from a brown-skinned man to a white woman could only mean one thing in the minds of the God-fearing citizens. Reverend Cornelius Hayes emerged from the church, his black coat buttoned tight despite the heat. His pale eyes surveyed Sarah with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully rooted out sin. "Have you reflected on your transgressions, Sister Mitchell?" "I've done nothing wrong," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse but defiant. "Miguel Santos is a decent man who showed Christian charity when this town turned its back on me." The Reverend's thin lips curved into a cold smile. "Christian charity? Is that what you call consorting with heathens? Allowing a Mexican to enter your home? The Lord sees all, woman." "The Lord also sees hypocrisy," Sarah shot back, causing several nearby townspeople to gasp. "Where was Christian charity when I couldn't afford food? When I asked the church for help?" Hayes's face darkened. "Your husband left debts. The mine company took your house. These are consequences of poor stewardship, not reasons to abandon moral virtue." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You will remain here until you confess your sins and beg forgiveness. The town must see that wickedness has consequences." As the Reverend walked away, Doc Henderson approached cautiously. The elderly physician had been one of the few to speak against this public humiliation, though his voice had been drowned out by the moral outrage of the majority. "This is madness, Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Hayes has whipped them into a frenzy. They're talking about running you out of town." "Maybe that would be a mercy," Sarah replied, testing the chains again. The iron had worn grooves in the wooden post, evidence of other unfortunates who'd been subjected to this cruel punishment. "I brought you this." Doc Henderson slipped a small piece of hardtack into her palm. "It's not much, but it's all I can manage without arousing suspicion." Sarah managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Doc. At least someone in this town remembers what compassion looks like." As evening approached, the temperature dropped dramatically, as it always did in the desert. Sarah's wet dress became a prison of cold fabric against her skin. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve warmth, but the chains limited her movement. The moon rose full and bright, casting eerie shadows across the empty street. Around midnight, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Fear shot through her. Drunken men had been known to take liberties with women in the stocks. But these footsteps were different, lighter, more deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows between the buildings, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to traveling unseen. Sarah's breath caught. Even in the moonlight she could see the distinctive clothing, the long black hair, the bronze skin. Apache. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she remained perfectly still. The warrior stopped about 10 feet away, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to hold both curiosity and something else. Was it compassion? For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the cultural divide that separated their worlds. Then, with movements so fluid they seemed like dance, the Apache warrior reached into a small pouch at his side and withdrew something. He stepped forward, just close enough to place a single white feather at Sarah's feet, then melted back into the shadows as silently as he'd appeared. Sarah stared at the feather, its pristine whiteness stark against the dusty ground. She didn't know what it meant, but something about the gesture, the solemnity of it, the risk the warrior had taken, brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt that someone, somewhere, understood that she was more than the sum of the town's accusations. The feather lay there like a promise, gleaming in the moonlight, as Sarah finally allowed herself to weep. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains with the promise of another scorching day. Sarah had dozed fitfully against the hitching post. the white feather clutched protectively in her palm. The sound of approaching hoofbeats jolted her awake as a group of riders thundered into town, dust clouds billowing behind them. "Apache sign!" shouted Jake Morrison, the town's self-appointed sheriff. "Found tracks near the Peterson Ranch. Fresh ones heading this way." Panic rippled through the early morning crowd gathering for Sunday service. Women clutched their children closer, while men fingered their gun belts nervously. Reverend Hayes emerged from the church, his face grave. "The Lord tests us," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square. "Evil begets evil. First we harbor sin in our midst." His cold gaze fell on Sarah. "And now the savages draw near." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the Apache warrior's visit might have been witnessed. The feather burned in her palm like evidence of guilt she hadn't committed. She quickly dropped it, but not before Mrs. Abernathy's sharp eyes caught the movement. "What's that there?" the woman shrieked, pointing at the white feather. "What's that heathen token doing at her feet?" The crowd pressed closer, murmuring fearfully. Jake Morrison dismounted and snatched up the feather, holding it aloft like a prosecutor's exhibit. "Eagle feather. Apache. This here's a message, sure as hell." "She's in league with them," someone shouted from the crowd. "The widows brought the savages down on us." Sarah's voice rose above the accusations. "I've never seen that feather before. Someone must have dropped it." "Liar," Hayes thundered. "The evidence of your wickedness multiplies. First the Mexican, now this. You've drawn evil to our town like a magnet draws iron." 5 miles outside town, Nalnish sat his paint horse atop a red stone ridge, watching the commotion through his father's old cavalry spyglass. He'd taken the risk of approaching the town again, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The white woman's dignity in the face of cruelty reminded him of his own mother, who had faced similar persecution from some members of their band when she'd insisted on learning the white man's language. "Stupid," he muttered to himself in Apache, then switched to the English he'd learned from the missionary schools. Should have stayed away. But he hadn't been able to forget the sight of her chained like an animal, abandoned by her own people. The feather had been an impulse, a gesture of respect from one outcast to another. Now it seemed his attempt at honor had only brought her more trouble. A movement in the rocks below caught his attention. 3 riders were approaching his position, their horses lathered with sweat. Recognition struck him. These were young men from his own band, warriors eager to prove themselves. "Nalnish," called out Dalje, the hothead son of the war chief. "We've been hunting you. Your father grows impatient. The council meets today about the white settlement." "I know when the council meets," Nalnish replied, not lowering his spyglass. "I'll be there." "Will you?" Dalje's voice carried a challenge. "Or will you stay here watching the white eyes like a love-struck boy?" The insult stung, but Nalnish kept his expression neutral. "Watch your tongue, Dalje. We are not at war with these people." "Not yet," the young warrior replied with a predatory grin. "But the signs are promising. Their fear makes them stupid. Soon they'll attack first, and then we'll have justification." Down in the town, Doc Henderson had pushed through the crowd to examine the feather. His weathered face was grim as he turned to address the mob. "This is hysteria. One feather doesn't make an invasion. It's a warning," Hayes insisted. "The heathen who left this knows she's corrupted. They're marking her as one of their own." Sarah struggled against her chains, desperation lending strength to her voice. "Dr. Henderson, you know this is madness. I've done nothing wrong." The doctor met her eyes with sympathy, but his voice was carefully neutral. "I know, Sarah, but folk are scared. Apache raiders hit the Martinez spread last month, took livestock, burned the barn. People are on edge." "Those weren't my people," Nalnish said quietly to his horse, though he knew the distinction would mean nothing to the frightened townspeople below. Young warriors from other bands sometimes raided for glory, but his father's group had maintained an uneasy peace with the settlers for 2 years. That peace was about to be shattered. Jake Morrison was already organizing a posse. "We'll track them Apache back to their camp, show them what happens when they threaten our women." "Jake, no," Doc Henderson protested. "You'll start a war over a feather and fear." "War's coming anyway," Morrison replied, checking his rifle. "Better to hit them first while we know where they are." As the armed men mounted their horses, Sarah felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a shroud. Her punishment had become a spark that would ignite violence between 2 peoples who barely understood each other. The white feather, meant as a gesture of respect, had become a harbinger of bloodshed. Nalnish watched the posse ride out, their dust trail heading directly toward the hidden canyon where his people made their temporary camp. He had perhaps an hour's head start, enough time to warn his father, but not enough to prevent the confrontation that was now inevitable. As he wheeled his horse around and galloped toward the mountains, he wondered if the white woman would survive what was coming. In trying to honor her dignity, he might have signed her death warrant. The sound of gunfire echoed across the desert like thunder, rolling down from the mountains and into Salvation Creek just as the sun reached its zenith. Sarah jerked against her chains, her heart hammering as she recognized the distant crack of rifles and the war cries that seemed to pierce the very air. "They're fighting," she whispered, though no one was close enough to hear. The town square had emptied when the posse rode out, leaving only a few frightened women peering from behind curtains and doorways. In the hidden canyon 5 miles north, Nalnish crouched behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. He'd reached his people just in time to warn them, but not soon enough to prevent the confrontation. The white posse had found their camp, and Jake Morrison's itchy trigger finger had done the rest. "This is your fault," Dalje shouted over the gunfire, his rifle smoking as he fired down at the white men positioned behind their horses. "Your midnight walks to their town brought this on us." Nalnish's father, Chief Cochise Nalnish, raised his weathered hand for silence. Despite being past 60, the old man's eyes were sharp as flint. "The blame matters less than the solution." "How many whites?" 12, reported another warrior. "They have good cover, but we have the high ground." "Anyone wounded?" "2 of theirs down. Young Martinez took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live." The chief nodded grimly. "This ends now, before it becomes a blood feud." He looked directly at his son. "You will ride with me under the white flag. We'll speak to their leader." "Father, they won't listen," Nalnish protested. "Their fear has made them deaf to reason." "Then we'll make them listen. But first, tell me about this white woman, the one who brought you back to their town." Nalnish felt heat rise in his face. "She's innocent of what they accuse her. They chain her like an animal for showing kindness to a Mexican trader. And you felt compelled to honor her suffering?" "The feather was meant as recognition of her dignity. Nothing more." The old chief studied his son's face for a long moment. "Perhaps it was meant as more than you knew. Come, we ride to parley." Down in the town, Dr. Henderson had finally convinced Reverend Hayes to let him examine Sarah. The woman was showing signs of heat exhaustion, and the doctor's medical oath compelled him to act despite the mob's wishes. "This has gone too far, Cornelius," Henderson said, as he pressed a water bottle to Sarah's lips. "Whatever she's done or not done, we can't let her die of thirst." "The Lord's justice is perfect," Hayes replied coldly. "If she perishes, it's by divine will." "Divine will, my ass," Henderson muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, but this isn't justice. It's cruelty dressed up in Bible verses." Sarah drank gratefully, the warm water tasting better than wine. "Doctor, the fighting in the mountains, is it because of the feather?" "I'm afraid so. Jake Morrison's got his blood up, and he's taken half the able-bodied men with him." Henderson's face was grim. "If any of them don't come back, they'll be hell to pay." As if summoned by his words, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. 2 riders approached under a white flag, an Apache chief and a younger warrior. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the dignity in their bearing, the way they sat their horses with natural grace. "Apache!" someone screamed from the saloon. "They're coming!" The few remaining townspeople scattered like leaves in a windstorm, but Reverend Hayes stood his ground, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Stay back, heathens! You have no business here." Chief Cochise Nalnish brought his horse to a halt 20 feet from the church. His English was careful, but clear. "I come to speak of peace. Your men attacked our camp without cause." "Your people threatened our town," Hayes shot back. "Left signs of your evil intentions." The chief's eyes found Sarah chained to the hitching post, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "The white woman. Why is she bound?" "That's no concern of yours, savage." Nalnish's jaw tightened at the insult, but his father raised a calming hand. "All suffering is our concern. What did she do to deserve this?" Sarah found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "I accepted food from a Mexican trader. They say I'm an adulteress." The Apache chief's weathered face hardened. "For this, you chain her in the sun? She's corrupted our town," Hayes insisted. "Brought your kind down on us with her wickedness." "My son left her a feather of honor," the chief said quietly. "It was meant to recognize her dignity in the face of cruelty, nothing more." "Honor?" Hayes laughed bitterly. "What would savages know of honor?" The insult hung in the air like smoke. Nalnish's hand moved toward his knife, but his father's sharp glance stopped him. Instead, The old chief dismounted and walked slowly towards Sarah. "What is your name, woman?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. I am Cochise Nalnish of the Chiricahua. My son tells me you showed kindness to a Mexican. This is good. The Apache also know the value of kindness between peoples." He reached into his pouch and withdrew a small piece of jerky, offering it to Sarah. Reverend Hayes stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Get away from her." "I offer food to one who hungers," the chief said calmly. "This is not war. This is mercy." "It's corruption." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the standoff. Jake Morrison's posse was returning, and from the looks on their faces, the news wasn't good. 2 horses carried wounded men, and the rest of the riders looked shaken. "They got the drop on us," Morrison reported, his voice bitter. "Lost Billy Peterson and Tom Wright. Damn near got me, too." The chief's expression grew sad. "Now there will be mourning in both camps. This is what fear brings. Death where there should be life." Sarah watched the 2 leaders face each other, seeing clearly how different their approaches were. The Apache chief sought understanding even in grief, while the white preacher nursed his hatred like a sacred flame. "This ends now," Hayes declared. "We'll send for the cavalry. They'll finish what you started." "And more will die," the chief replied, "including the woman you punish for crimes she did not commit." As the Apache father and son rode away, Sarah realized that the feather had done more than mark her as an outcast. It had revealed the true nature of both communities. The question now was whether understanding could bloom in such poisoned soil, or whether fear would consume them all. The cavalry arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the red dirt of Salvation Creek. Captain William Brennan, a weathered Irish veteran of the Civil War, surveyed the scene with professional detachment. His eyes lingered on Sarah, still chained to the hitching post, despite Dr. Henderson's repeated protests. "Explain this to me again," Brennan said to Reverend Hayes, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "You've got a woman chained up like a dog, and you're telling me this started an Indian war." Hayes bristled at the captain's tone. "That woman consorted with heathens and brought Apache raiders down on our town. 2 good men are dead because of her wickedness. 2 good men are dead because Jake Morrison couldn't keep his finger off the trigger," Doc Henderson interjected, earning a sharp look from the Reverend. "Captain, this whole mess started over a feather, a damned feather." Brennan knelt beside Sarah, noting her cracked lips and the raw wounds on her wrists. "Ma'am, I need to hear your version of events." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I accepted food from Miguel Santos, a Mexican trader, when I couldn't afford to buy any. The town decided that made me an adulteress. The Apache, one of them left a feather near me. I never spoke to him, never saw him before that night. And for this they chained you in the desert sun for 3 days. Brennan's disgust was evident. "Reverend, this is barbaric, even by frontier standards. The woman needed to confess her sins," Hayes replied stiffly. "The community demanded justice." "Justice?" Brennan stood, his hand resting on his saber. "Captain, I've seen Confederate prisoners treated better than this. Release her immediately." "You have no authority over church matters," Hayes protested. "I have authority over anything that threatens the peace, and this," he gestured at Sarah, "is what's threatening the peace, not some Apache leaving a feather." In the mountains, Nalnish watched the blue-coated soldiers through his spyglass. He'd been scouting their position since before dawn, noting their numbers and weaponry. 30 men, well-armed and disciplined. His father's band numbered only 18 warriors, with women and children to protect. "They're not moving toward the canyon," he reported to his father. "They're staying in the town." Chief Cochise Nalnish nodded thoughtfully. "This captain is wiser than the preacher. He knows the real enemy is fear, not us." "The young warriors grow restless," Nalnish warned. "Dalje speaks of revenge for the attack on our camp." "Let him speak. Words are wind. But you, my son, you've been walking between worlds since you were a boy. What do you see in this white woman that draws you back to their town?" Nalnish was quiet for a long moment. "She reminds me of Mother, the way she held her head high when they bound her. She has dignity." "Dignity is rare among any people," the chief observed. "Perhaps that's why it calls to you." Back in town, Captain Brennan had ordered Sarah's chains removed, despite Reverend Hayes's furious objections. Dr. Henderson was tending to her wounds, while the captain questioned witnesses about the skirmish in the mountains. "The Apache flew a white flag," Henderson reported. "The chief wanted to parley, but Jake Morrison and his boys were too wound up to listen." "Where's Morrison now?" "Drunk in the saloon last I saw. This whole thing's eating at him. He's not a bad man, Captain, just scared and angry. Brennan nodded. Fear makes fools of us all. What about this Mexican trader the woman supposedly consorted with? Miguel Santos, good man, honest dealer. Been trading through here for years without trouble. I'd like to speak with him. Dr. Henderson's face grew troubled. You can't. Hayes ran him out of town the morning after they chained Sarah. Told him if he came back, they'd string him up. Jesus Christ, Brennan muttered. So they punish the woman and exile the man who helped her. What kind of Christianity is that? Sarah, finally able to sit in the shade of the doctor's office, spoke up. The kind that forgets Christ ate with tax collectors and sinners. They've turned faith into a weapon. As evening approached, Nalnish made a decision that would have horrified his father. He would return to the town, not to leave another token, but to speak with the white woman directly. She had become a symbol of something larger than herself, a bridge between worlds that both sides seemed determined to burn. He approached from the east, using the shadows of the adobe buildings to conceal his movement. The cavalry had posted sentries, but they were watching the main approaches, not expecting a single Apache to slip through their lines. Sarah was sitting on the doctor's porch, her wounds bandaged and a cup of broth in her hands. She looked up as a shadow detached itself from the alley beside the building. Don't be afraid, Nalnish said softly in English. I'm not here to harm you. Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. You're him, the one who left the feather. I am Nalnish. I came to see if you were, well, why? She asked. You don't know me. Your people and mine are at war because of what you did. They're at war because of what they choose to believe about what I did, he corrected. I left the feather because I saw someone suffering with dignity. That deserves recognition. Your recognition nearly got me killed. Their fear nearly got you killed. The feather was just an excuse. He stepped closer, his voice urgent. The soldiers will leave soon. When they do, what happens to you? Sarah considered this. The town still saw her as a pariah, and with Miguel gone, she had no means of support. I don't know. Maybe it would be better if I left too. Where would you go? I don't know that either. Nalnish studied her face in the moonlight. My father spoke of you. He said you showed kindness to the Mexican trader. That's why they punish you. Not for any sin, but for remembering that we're all human. Your father seems like a wise man. He is. He also said something else. He said perhaps the feather was meant as more than I knew. Nalnish paused. There's a place, 2 days' ride north, a valley where the creek runs year-round. Peaceful, safe. You're asking me to leave with you. I'm offering you a choice. Stay here and face their hatred, or come with me and face the unknown. Sarah looked at the town that had been her home for 5 years, the place where she'd buried her husband and her hopes. Then she looked at the Apache warrior who'd risked everything to show her kindness. If I go with you, what happens to the peace your father wants? Maybe, Nalnish said quietly, peace begins with two people choosing understanding over fear. The decision that would change both their lives hung in the desert air like a prayer waiting to be answered. Sarah's decision came with the first light of dawn. She'd spent the night on Dr. Henderson's porch, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the distant sounds of the cavalry camp. When Nalnish emerged from the shadows, where he'd waited through the dark hours, she was ready. I'll come with you, she said simply, but not to run away, to find a way forward. Nalnish nodded, understanding more in her words than she'd spoken. My father will want to meet you properly, as equals. And if your people reject me the way mine have, then we'll face that together. Captain Brennan discovered Sarah's absence when he came to check on her condition. Dr. Henderson handed him a letter she'd written by lamplight, her handwriting shaky but determined. Captain Brennan, the doctor read aloud, I've chosen to leave Salvation Creek of my own free will. I go not as a traitor to my people, but as someone who believes understanding between our peoples is possible. If you're the good man I believe you to be, you'll prevent this town from using my departure as an excuse for more violence. The choice for peace or war lies with those who remain. Sarah Mitchell. Brennan folded the letter carefully. Smart woman. She's given us all a way out of this mess if we're wise enough to take it. You're not going after her? Dr. Henderson asked. She's a free citizen who left of her own accord. I've got no legal grounds to pursue her, and frankly I'm not sure I'd want to bring her back to face this town's judgment again. In the mountains, Sarah rode behind Nalnish on his paint horse, her arms wrapped around his waist as they climbed narrow trails that seemed to lead straight into the sky. The higher they went, the more the desert gave way to pine and aspen, the air growing thin and sweet. Your father's camp is beautiful, she said as they crested a ridge overlooking a hidden valley where smoke rose from carefully concealed fires. It's temporary, Nalnish replied. We move with the seasons. But this has been a refuge for my people for generations. The camp that spread below them was nothing like the savage encampment Sarah had imagined from the town's fearful whispers. Children played near the stream, while women worked hides and tended fires. Men sat in circles, some crafting weapons, others simply talking. It looked, she realized, like any community trying to make a life in difficult circumstances. Chief Cochise Nalnish received them beside the central fire, his weathered face grave, but not unkind. Several warriors had gathered, including the young hothead Dalje, whose expression was openly hostile. Father, Nalnish said in Apache, then switched to English for Sarah's benefit. This is Sarah Mitchell. She's chosen to leave her people and seek understanding with ours. I've heard of you, the chief said to Sarah, the woman who showed kindness to the Mexican trader, and brought trouble to our camp, Dalje added sharply. Why should we trust her? She could be a spy. A spy chained in the sun for 3 days? Nalnish's voice carried an edge of anger. Think before you speak, Dalje. Peace, the chief said, raising his hand. Sarah Mitchell, why did you come here? Sarah met his eyes directly. Because I believe your son when he says peace is possible. Because I've seen what hatred does to people, how it makes them forget their own humanity. If there's to be a future for any of us in this land, it has to start with someone taking the first step toward understanding. An older woman approached the fire, her grey hair braided with silver ornaments. She studied Sarah with keen eyes before speaking in Apache. Nalnish translated. My aunt Desba asks why you trust us when your own people cast you out. Because, Sarah replied, you've shown me more kindness in 2 days than my own people did in 3 months of widowhood. Desba smiled at the translation and said something else. This time Nalnish looked uncomfortable as he translated. She says you have the look of someone who's lost much, but hasn't let it make her bitter. She asks if you would learn our ways. I would be honored to learn. Over the following days, Sarah found herself drawn into the daily life of the camp. Desba taught her to grind corn and prepare traditional foods. She learned basic Apache phrases and began to understand the complex social structure that held the community together. Most importantly, she discovered that the Apache were not the savage raiders of frontier legend, but a people trying to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming change. Meanwhile, in Salvation Creek, Captain Brennan worked to prevent the escalation that both sides feared. He met with Reverend Hayes and the remaining town leaders, explaining the military's position with blunt clarity. The woman left of her own free will, he told them. She's committed no crime, except accepting charity from a Mexican trader. If you use her departure as an excuse to attack the Apache, you'll be fighting the United States Army as well as them. She's been corrupted by savages, Hayes insisted. She'll bring back information about our defenses. What defenses? Brennan asked dryly. A church, a saloon, and a general store? Reverend, you're looking for reasons to hate when you should be looking for reasons to hope. A week later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Apache camp. Miguel Santos, the Mexican trader, had tracked them through the mountains with a small pack train of goods. His reunion with Sarah was emotional. He'd feared she'd been killed for helping him. Senora Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I am so sorry. I never meant for you to suffer because of my kindness. Your kindness was the only light in a dark time, Sarah replied. Don't apologize for being human. Miguel's presence gave Sarah an idea. Miguel, you trade with both peoples. You know both languages, both ways of thinking. Could you help us find a way to make peace? The trader considered this. Perhaps, but it would require trust from both sides. And trust is the one thing that's been broken beyond repair. Not beyond repair, Nalnish said quietly. Damaged, yes, but not beyond repair. Chief Cochise Nalnish had been listening to the conversation with growing interest. What do you propose? Sarah looked around the circle of faces. Apache, Mexican, and white. A meeting. Not under a flag of truce, but under a flag of hope. Captain Brennan is an honorable man. Dr. Henderson has a good heart. If we could bring them here, let them see what I've seen. And if they betray us? Dalje asked. Then we'll be no worse off than we are now, Sarah replied. But if they don't, if they're willing to listen? The chief was quiet for a long moment. You would risk much for people who cast you out. I would risk much for the chance that no other woman has to be chained in the sun for showing kindness, that no other fathers have to bury sons killed by fear. 2 days later, Captain Brennan and Dr. Henderson, along with Miguel Santos as interpreter, rode into the Apache camp under a white flag. What they found there challenged everything they thought they knew about the savage Apache. The meeting lasted 3 days. There were tense moments, misunderstandings, and the ever-present threat of violence. But slowly, carefully, the outline of an understanding began to emerge. Trade agreements that would benefit both communities, mutual defense pacts against the real enemies, drought, disease, and the lawless elements that plagued the frontier. Most importantly, they established a precedent that people of different cultures could sit together, speak honestly, and find common ground without abandoning their own identities. When the negotiations concluded, Captain Brennan approached Sarah privately. "The door's open if you want to come back. Not everyone in town agrees with Hayes." Sarah looked across the valley where Apache children played alongside Miguel's young sons, where Nalnish was teaching Dr. Henderson to track game, where her own presence had become a bridge between worlds. "Thank you, Captain, but I think I'm exactly where I belong." As the sun set over the mountains, Sarah Mitchell, no longer the outcast widow of Salvation Creek, but the woman who chose understanding over hatred, stood beside Nalnish and watched the first day of an uncertain but hopeful future begin. The white feather, now tucked safely in her medicine bundle, had become what it was always meant to be, a symbol of dignity, honor, and the courage to build bridges instead of walls.